Today, we're dreaming big. Here's 10 bucket list bourbons to try before you die. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Hutch, and thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the world of whiskey. So today we're doing something different. We are not talking about anything that I have been able to get my hands on or anything that exists in the hutch or in my collection. Today we're dreaming. We're dreaming about those incredibly hard to find, rare, special bottles that, if we're honest with ourselves, we'd all like to get our hands on, but more realistically, we'd all like to at least try before we die. So this is basically my personal bourbon bucket list. So it's a list of bourbons I want to try before I die, but I'm sure there will be many that resonate with you as ones that you are constantly chasing after, looking for, even just looking to see if bars have maybe a decent price on trying one of these bottles. So the bucket list I've composed here does have a mix of options that are somewhat realistic to maybe find at some point in your life, all the way up to ones that it's very, very low likelihood that you'll ever get your hands on one of them. But I think that's part of the fun of dreaming here. So without further ado, let's get into the list. And let's just start with the big guns. I mean, all of these are rare, but let's start with the ultra, ultra rare, and that's gonna be Pappy Van Winkle. I specifically would flag out the 23 year just to try something that ultra aged and see how it tastes. This is the most famous, most sought after bourbon in the world, basically, from Buffalo Trace Distillery, which has a lot of well sought after bourbon. It's their wheated profile. And for me, again, it would just be a matter of, I would love to even just try it and see if all the crazy hype and crazy even like legal problems that people have gotten into chasing Pappy and fabricating it and faking bottles. I just want to know what's up with Pappy Van Winkle. I've never tasted anything from that line, so would love to try it. And why not shoot for the stars with the 23-year-old version? All right, for second on the list, let's just stick with Buffalo Trace because, like I said, so much of their stuff is so highly allocated and well sought after. For me, the next one is going to be a BTAC bottle. Specifically, I would flag out here the William LaRue Weller because I have heard that that one has been particularly awesome in the last 4 to 5 years or so, though I wouldn't say no to any of the others, and I think particularly the George T. Stagg bourbon, that's another one that just apparently always gets fantastic reviews pretty much. So for me, these are MSRP around $100, which would be realistic for me to grab, but you know what? I'm probably never gonna see them, and I'm probably never gonna see them at that price. Still, these ones, you might get lucky, you might win a lottery. There's some ways to get your hands on these bottles. It's very rare that it happens, but on the off chance that it does, you get to have one of the most special bottles of your life to cherish. And for me, something that allocated that special from Buffalo Trace would be just something that I would be ecstatic to add to the collection, even if it's not ultimately one of the best batches ever or something like that. I just think everybody's looking for BTAC, and it's got to go on the list of 10 whiskeys to try before you die. All right, with bottle 3, we'll pivot away from Buffalo Trace and we'll go to a distillery that I have personally fallen in love with, and that's Old Forester, in particular, Old Forester Birthday Bourbon. So this one does sometimes have batches that people rate a little bit lower and say aren't so great, but sometimes it has batches that people say is some of the best whiskey they've ever tasted. So a little bit hit or miss, but I would love to get my hands on one of these bottles or just try it at some point, because I think that this is just a distillery that I love. It's a profile that I love, and seeing an even more special, highly sought after, and specifically picked for the birthday bourbon kind of release, I would love to taste it, and it certainly deserves a spot on this list. All right, bottle number 4, let's mix in one here that gets us in that more like realistic, possible to find category, and that's gonna be Michter's 10 Bourbon. So there are other Michter's releases that go older than this. I think there's a 20-year-old release. There's been a 25 anniversary year release. Lots of ultra-aged special stuff that's even more, highly allocated and highly sought after. But for me, these Michter's 10 bourbons, I think that there's both a bourbon and a rye, but we'll stick with the bourbon for the bourbon list. I am searching for these, always keeping my eyes out, my ears sort of tuned into where they might be. I've never seen one on shelves, but it's one that I think I could realistically get in my whiskey hunting journey. And from all that I've heard, the Michter's 10, something that aged from them, can be just phenomenal stuff. So I would love to try it and get my hands on one and add it to the collection. And I think it deserves a spot on this list because primarily it is a little bit more realistic to find, and I think you gotta have some on here that can give you some hope. All right, bottle number 5 on this list is a more recent release that has just gotten rave reviews and a heck of a lot of attention since it came out, and that's gonna be Russell's Reserve 13 year. So this bottle with the blue label, it is highly sought after. It's not all that terribly expensive MSRP wise, but it is very difficult to find and highly marked up. If you see it anywhere near secondary prices, that's probably going to be more in that like $500 category. But apparently this 13-year-old whiskey from Wild Turkey, very carefully selected and put together, is just phenomenal. Some people were calling it the best whiskey they've ever tasted when it first came out. Could probably take down BTAC, other things like that. Not sure if every release is going to be that consistently great, but in terms of whiskeys that I would love to try before I die and that go on this bucket list, I think that Russell's Reserve 13 certainly deserves a spot and is one that, again, you might have some chance of finding if you look for it over a good considerable span of time. All right, bottle number 6 on this list has 2 aspects. I've heard the bourbon is great and the presentation is phenomenal, and that's going to be Old Fitz bottled in bond. So Old Fitzgerald bourbon from Heaven Hill Distillery comes in a beautiful decanter bottle with amazing presentation. These have had ages ranging from like 8 or 9 years. I think there's a younger version. Then there's like been a 15-year, a 17-year, a 19-year release. Would love to get my hands on one of those older ones. I think the distillery down at Heaven Hill occasionally has drops of these, so always kind of keeping an ear out. Maybe I can get down there one day for one of those releases. But in terms of a whiskey and just a bottle that sort of screams that it's special just by looking at it, I think Old Fitzgerald bottled in bond certainly fits on this list. All right, we'll stick with Heaven Hill as a massive distillery that I really appreciate and love a lot of their products. Next from them on this list is a Parker's Heritage release. I'm specifically thinking of the double-barreled bourbon, which I have heard nothing but phenomenal things about. Would love to try that, would love to get a bottle of that. These, again, are more in that you could possibly get your hands on one. I think, again, the distillery does releases of these, so it's always possible, and I think that's great. I also, again, have just heard great things about this lineup, and especially the double-barreled bourbon, so I would love to try it. Again, people were raving about it, saying that it could take down BTAC and other things like that as one of the best releases of the year. So really interested to see how that continues to develop, how more Parker's Heritage releases come off to the general public. But again, this is one that I think goes on the list and, again, gives you a little bit of hope that maybe you could get something really, really special and cherish it. And again, I think part of the purpose of the list is to give some realistic options that are certain stretch goals and stretch bottles that we're all aiming to get. All right, next on the list takes us to a distillery with some legendary releases, and that is Four Roses. And I'm thinking specifically of the limited edition small batch releases that come out every year. So I've heard, again, phenomenal things about these. The 2021 and 2022 releases apparently were really, really great. These are very special releases from Four Roses. I mean, Four Roses has 10 recipes. They do a lot of awesome releases with those barrel strength options at the distillery. They have a great lineup, if you ask me, of just regular available options, but these limited editions seem to be some of the most special, regular, highly sought after releases from Four Roses, and I would love to get my hands on one at some point. All right, next is a bottle that I personally don't know too much about, but in terms of whiskeys of the year and ones that seem to just always get rave reviews, it's always at the top of the list, and that is King of Kentucky bourbon. So again, for me, this is one that I'm not as familiar with. I haven't spent much time researching it, but when I was thinking about this list and ones that I've heard other YouTubers and reviewers talk about, King of Kentucky seems to be right there at the top of the list in terms of quality and just rarity and special releases that if you could get your hands on one of those, it would kind of be a lifetime find. All right, last but not least, we'll do one that actually technically doesn't really fit in the bourbon category, but that's okay because it is a slightly more realistic one, and that's going to be Jack Daniel's Coy Hill. And for me, this one is a newer release that has gotten incredible reviews. It's also often like hazmat level with like 140 proof or above proof point, which I can't even really wrap my mind around quite fully, but I would love to taste it, love to try something that high octane. But the key here is that most reviewers that I've seen, they talk about it as a absolute flavor bomb. Even though it's that high proof, it is packed full of flavor, which I would just love to have that experience. All right, everybody, that's gonna do it. That's 10 bourbons, or I guess 9 with adding the Jack Daniel's Coy Hill in there. Basically, this is a list that if I could get any one of these, I would be ecstatic. If I could get more than one, I would just be over the moon. And for some of them, like Pappy Van Winkle and B-Tac and King of Kentucky, if I just got to taste those, I think I would consider it a win and know what everybody's talking about when they talk about some of these most hyped up bottles of all time. Let me know in the comments below. What did I miss? What would you add? What would you put on your own personal list? And if you had to pick one bottle that you would specifically love to add to your collection, what would it be? Until I see you guys again for another video, all I can say is keep drinking good whiskey, keep hunting and shooting for the stars and dreaming about those great bottles, and cheers.